Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to wake up as a Viking warrior in the year 950? Not the Hollywood version with the horned helmets and constant bloodshed, but the real deal. What did these legendary Norse people actually do when they weren't raiding monasteries or sailing across unknown seas? Well, the answer might shock you, because the daily life of Vikings was nothing like what you've been told. These weren't just savage warriors living in chaos. Instead, they had incredibly structured societies with complex daily routines that would make your modern schedule look simple by comparison. So in this video, I'm going to reveal what Vikings really did all day, using historical evidence that will completely change how you think about Norse culture. We're going to walk through a typical day from sunrise to sunset, and I'll show you activities that most people have never heard of, but were absolutely essential to Viking survival. What I'm going to do is take you through their morning routines, their work responsibilities, their social customs, and their evening rituals step by step. But first, let me give you some context so you understand just how wrong our modern assumptions are. Most people think Vikings spent their days sharpening swords and planning raids, but archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Recent excavations across Scandinavia have uncovered detailed information about Viking daily life that historians are still processing today. The reality is that less than 5% of Vikings were actually warriors. The other 95% were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and families just trying to survive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Here's what makes this even more fascinating. I've spent the last 6 months researching primary sources, archaeological reports, and historical documents to piece together the most accurate picture possible of Viking daily life. I've consulted with Norse historians, examined artifact collections, and even visited reconstructed Viking settlements to understand how these people actually lived. The amount of misinformation out there is staggering, which is why I wanted to create this comprehensive breakdown. But before we dive into their daily routine, you need to understand something crucial about Viking society that changes everything. Vikings weren't a unified culture with identical lifestyles. They were spread across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and eventually settlements throughout Europe. A Viking farmer in rural Norway lived completely differently than a Viking trader in Dublin or a Viking settler in Iceland. Their daily routines varied dramatically based on their location, social status, occupation, and the season. However, there were common patterns that most Vikings followed, regardless of where they lived. These patterns were shaped by the brutal realities of Scandinavian geography, the short growing seasons, the long dark winters, and the constant need to prepare for survival. Every single day was structured around these fundamental challenges. So let's start with the morning, because this is where most people get their first major misconception about Viking life. The average Viking didn't wake up when they felt like it. They woke up before dawn, not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded it. During the summer months when daylight could last up to 20 hours in northern Scandinavia, Vikings maximized every moment of light for productive work. During winter, when they might only get 4 hours of weak sunlight, every minute became precious. But here's where it gets interesting. Vikings didn't just stumble out of bed and start their day randomly. They had specific morning rituals that were deeply connected to their spiritual beliefs and practical needs. The first thing most Vikings did was check their animals. Livestock was literally the difference between life and death, so ensuring that cows, goats, sheep, and pigs had survived the night was the absolute top priority. Think about this from their perspective. You're living in a wooden longhouse with your extended family, probably between 10 to 20 people sharing the same space. You've got animals either inside with you or in attached buildings. The temperature outside might be 20 degrees below zero. One sick cow or one broken fence could mean starvation for your entire family by spring. So the morning animal check wasn't just a casual glance. Vikings examined each animal for signs of illness, injury, or distress. They checked food supplies, water sources, and shelter conditions. They looked for predator tracks around the property. They counted their livestock to make sure nothing had been stolen or wandered off. This process could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the size of their farm. While the men typically handled the larger animals and exterior security, Viking women had equally demanding morning responsibilities. They were responsible for the household fire, which was absolutely critical for survival. In many Viking homes, the central hearth fire was never allowed to go out completely, because rekindling it was time-consuming and wasted precious resources. Viking women woke up early to tend the fire, add fuel, and begin preparing the morning meal. But this wasn't like flipping on a stove. They had to carefully manage wood supplies, maintain proper ventilation to prevent smoke inhalation, and ensure the fire provided adequate heat and light for the entire household. The placement and management of fire was so important that many Viking homes had designated firekeepers, usually older women or young adults, whose primary job was fire maintenance. The morning meal preparation was another complex process that started before most of the household was awake. Vikings typically ate 2 main meals per day, one in the morning and one in the evening, with small snacks in between if food was available. The morning meal usually consisted of porridge made from barley, oats, or rye, sometimes mixed with milk if they had dairy cows. They might add honey if available, dried fruits, nuts, or small pieces of preserved meat. But preparing this meal required multiple steps that modern people never consider. The grain had to be ground, often by hand using stone querns. Water had to be collected, sometimes from wells or streams that were quite far from the house. Milk had to be collected from animals that might be reluctant to cooperate in cold weather. Every ingredient required individual attention and preparation time. Meanwhile, Viking children had their own morning responsibilities that were absolutely essential to household survival. Children as young as 5 or 6 years old were expected to contribute meaningfully to daily operations. Their tasks included collecting eggs from chickens, gathering kindling for fires, feeding smaller animals like chickens and goats, and helping with basic food preparation. This wasn't child labor in the modern sense, but rather survival training. Viking children needed to learn these skills because their lives would eventually depend on them. Parents understood that a child who couldn't perform these basic tasks would struggle to survive as an adult in their harsh environment. The morning routine also included personal hygiene, which is another area where modern assumptions about Vikings are completely wrong. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings were actually quite concerned with cleanliness and personal appearance. They bathed regularly, groomed their hair and beards carefully, and took pride in their clothing and accessories. Viking men typically began their day by washing their face and hands with cold water, often collected from nearby streams or wells. They used simple soaps made from animal fats and plant ashes. They combed their hair and beards using bone or antler combs, many of which were intricately decorated and considered valuable possessions. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings owned multiple combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and other grooming tools. Viking women had even more elaborate morning grooming routines. They braided their long hair in complex patterns that indicated their social status and marital situation. They applied simple cosmetics made from natural materials like berries for lip color or charcoal for eye enhancement. They carefully selected their clothing and jewelry, which served as indicators of their family's wealth and social position. The clothing selection process was more complex than you might imagine. Vikings didn't have closets full of options, but they did have different outfits for different activities and social situations. Work clothes were practical and durable, made from wool or linen that could withstand physical labor and harsh weather. Social clothes were more decorative, often featuring intricate embroidery, metal fasteners, and imported materials that demonstrated wealth and status. After personal grooming and the morning meal, Vikings began their primary work activities, which varied dramatically based on the season, their occupation, and their social position. But before we get into the specific jobs and tasks that filled their days, you need to understand something crucial about Viking work culture that explains everything else about their society. Vikings didn't separate work and family life the way modern people do. The household was the economic unit, and every family member contributed to the collective survival and prosperity. There was no concept of going to an office or leaving home for work. Instead, all economic activity centered around the family farm, craft workshop, or trading operation that was typically located on or adjacent to their living space. This meant that Viking daily life was incredibly integrated. While the father might be working on weapon maintenance or livestock management, the mother could be weaving cloth or preparing preserved foods. Teenage children might be learning specialized crafts or helping with agricultural work, and younger children would be performing age-appropriate support tasks. Everyone worked together toward common goals that benefited the entire household. The specific nature of daily work depended heavily on the season, because Viking survival was completely tied to the agricultural calendar and the dramatic seasonal changes in Scandinavia. Summer work was intense and focused on maximizing production during the short growing season. Winter work was more focused on maintenance, craft production, and preparation for the following year. During summer months, Viking farmers worked incredibly long hours to take advantage of the extended daylight. They planted crops, tended livestock, harvested wild foods, and prepared for winter storage. The summer workday often lasted 16 to 18 hours, with brief breaks for meals and rest. This wasn't sustainable year-round, but it was absolutely necessary to accumulate enough resources for winter survival. But here's where Viking daily life becomes absolutely fascinating, because their work wasn't just about survival. It was about building wealth, status, and security for future generations. Viking farmers weren't just growing enough food to get by. They were strategically managing resources to create surplus that could be traded, stored, or used to support extended family members and social obligations. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like in practice. A typical Viking farmer during summer would wake up around 4 in the morning when the sun was already well above the horizon. After the morning animal check and meal, he would spend the next several hours working in the fields. But this wasn't simple farming like you might imagine. Viking agriculture was incredibly sophisticated and required detailed knowledge of soil conditions, weather patterns, and crop rotation techniques. They grew barley, oats, rye, and wheat in carefully planned field systems. They understood that certain crops depleted soil nutrients while others restored them. They knew which varieties would survive unexpected cold snaps and which ones produced the highest yields in good conditions. The actual fieldwork involved multiple complex tasks that had to be perfectly timed. Ploughing with wooden ploughs, pulled by oxen or horses, required skill to create proper furrows without damaging the soil structure. Seeding had to be done at exactly the right depth and spacing to maximize germination. Weeding required constant attention because a field overrun with weeds would produce virtually no usable crops. But here's what makes this really interesting. Viking farmers didn't work alone. They organized cooperative labor groups with their neighbors and extended family members. During crucial periods like planting or harvest, multiple households would work together to complete tasks efficiently. This created strong social bonds and mutual obligations that were essential to community survival. While the men focused on heavy agricultural work, Viking women managed equally complex and demanding tasks that were absolutely critical to household success. The textile production alone was a massive undertaking that consumed enormous amounts of time and skill. Think about this for a moment. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every sail for their boats had to be created by hand from raw materials. Viking women started with sheep wool or plant fibers like flax. They had to clean, sort, and prepare these materials. They spun thread using wooden spindles and spinning wheels. They wove cloth on large looms that were permanently installed in their homes. They dyed fabrics using natural materials like berries, bark, and imported substances. The weaving process alone could take weeks or months to complete a single piece of cloth large enough for a cloak or dress. A high-quality woolen cloak might require wool from multiple sheep, hundreds of hours of spinning, and several weeks of careful weaving. The finished product wasn't just clothing. It was a valuable commodity that could be traded or given as gifts to strengthen social relationships. But textile work was just one part of women's daily responsibilities. They also managed food preservation, which was literally a matter of life and death for Viking families. During the short summer growing season, women had to process and preserve enormous quantities of food to last through the long winter months. This preservation work required incredible skill and timing. They dried fish and meat using carefully controlled smoking processes. They fermented dairy products to create cheeses and preserved milk. They pickled vegetables in brine solutions. They prepared complex preserved foods like blood sausages that combined multiple ingredients and required precise preparation techniques. The dairy work alone was a full-time occupation during summer months. Viking women milked cows, goats, and sheep multiple times per day. They processed this milk into butter, cheese, and other preserved dairy products using techniques that had been passed down through generations. They understood the exact timing required for different types of cheese, the proper storage conditions to prevent spoilage, and the seasonal variations that affected milk quality and quantity. Meanwhile, Viking children were receiving intensive education in the skills they would need as adults. But this wasn't classroom learning. It was hands-on apprenticeship that began at a very young age and continued throughout their youth. Young boys learned farming, animal husbandry, woodworking, metalworking, and basic weapons skills. They started with simple tasks like feeding chickens or collecting eggs, but gradually took on more complex responsibilities like ploughing fields, managing livestock, and crafting tools. By their early teens, many boys were capable of performing most adult male tasks, though they continued learning advanced techniques and developing their expertise. Young girls learned textile production, food preservation, household management, and childcare. They started with basic tasks like spinning thread or helping with cooking, but gradually mastered complex skills like weaving intricate patterns, managing large-scale food preservation projects, and running entire households. Like the boys, they were expected to be functionally competent in adult responsibilities by their early teens. But here's something that might surprise you about Viking education. It wasn't just about practical skills. Viking children also learned complex oral traditions, including poetry, stories, genealogies, and legal codes. They memorized hundreds of stories and poems that preserved their cultural history and values. They learned to recite family genealogies going back multiple generations. They understood legal procedures and social obligations that governed Viking society. This oral education happened primarily in the evenings during the long winter months when outdoor work was limited. Families gathered around the central hearth while adults told stories, recited poetry, and taught traditional knowledge to the younger generation. These weren't just entertainment sessions. They were formal education that preserved essential cultural information and prepared children for adult social responsibilities. The craft specialization in Viking society was far more advanced than most people realize. While every Viking family had basic skills in farming, textile work, and tool maintenance, many households also specialized in particular crafts that provided additional income and social status. Viking blacksmiths were highly respected specialists who created everything from simple farming tools to complex weapons and jewelry. The blacksmithing process required years of training and access to specialized equipment and materials. A master blacksmith needed to understand metallurgy, fuel management, tool maintenance, and artistic design. They created products that were essential to their community's survival and prosperity. But blacksmithing wasn't a simple daily routine. It required careful planning and resource management. Iron ore had to be located, mined, and processed into usable metal. Charcoal had to be produced from wood using controlled burning techniques. Tools and equipment had to be maintained and replaced regularly. The actual forging work required intense physical effort and precise timing to create high-quality products. Viking woodworkers created everything from simple household items to sophisticated ships and buildings. They understood different wood types and their properties. They knew which trees to harvest at which times of year for optimal wood quality. They used complex joinery techniques that created strong, durable constructions without metal fasteners. The shipbuilding process alone demonstrates the incredible sophistication of Viking woodworking skills. A single Viking longship required wood from dozens of trees that had to be carefully selected and prepared. The construction process took months or years and required coordination between multiple skilled craftsmen. The finished ships were technological marvels that enabled Viking exploration and trade across vast distances. Viking jewelers and decorative craftsmen created intricate metalwork, bone carving, and artistic objects that served both practical and social functions. They worked with gold, silver, bronze, and other materials to create brooches, arm rings, necklaces, and decorative elements for weapons and tools. These items weren't just decorative, they were displays of wealth, indicators of social status, and stores of value that could be traded or inherited. The level of artistic sophistication in Viking decorative arts was extraordinary. They created complex interlaced patterns, animal motifs, and geometric designs that required years of training to master. They understood how to work with different materials and how to combine multiple techniques to create finished pieces that were both beautiful and functional. But perhaps the most important aspect of Viking daily life was their trading activities, which connected individual households to a vast network of economic relationships that stretched across Europe and beyond. Vikings weren't just farmers and craftsmen. They were active participants in long-distance trade networks that brought exotic goods, new technologies, and cultural influences to Scandinavian communities. This trading activity wasn't separate from daily life. It was integrated into the regular routines of Viking households throughout the year. Families produced surplus goods specifically for trade. They maintained relationships with traveling merchants. They participated in seasonal markets and trading expeditions that could last for months. The preparation for trading activities required careful planning and coordination. Viking households had to identify which of their products had the highest trade value. They had to accumulate sufficient quantities of trade goods to make expeditions profitable. They had to maintain and repair the boats, wagons, and equipment needed for long-distance travel. During the trading seasons, Viking communities became bustling centers of economic activity as merchants arrived from distant regions bringing exotic goods and new information about opportunities in foreign markets. Local families would display their best products, negotiate complex deals, and establish relationships that would continue for years or decades. The social aspects of these trading relationships were just as important as the economic benefits. Viking merchants brought news from distant regions, stories of new opportunities, and information about political developments that could affect local communities. They facilitated marriages between families from different regions. They spread technological innovations and cultural practices across vast distances. The trading expeditions themselves reveal another fascinating aspect of Viking daily life that completely contradicts popular misconceptions. These weren't violent raiding parties setting off to pillage and plunder. They were carefully organized business ventures that required months of preparation and sophisticated logistical planning. A typical Viking trading expedition began with extensive preparation that involved entire communities. Families would spend weeks preparing trade goods, repairing ships, gathering supplies, and organizing the crew. The trade goods weren't just random items they happened to have lying around. Vikings strategically produced specific products that they knew would be highly valued in distant markets. For example, Scandinavian furs were incredibly valuable in southern Europe where such high-quality pelts weren't available. Viking households would spend months preparing and processing furs from animals they had trapped or hunted specifically for trade. They understood which types of furs commanded the highest prices, how to properly cure and prepare them, and which markets offered the best opportunities. Similarly, Viking craftsmen created specialized products designed specifically for export. They produced high-quality weapons that were renowned throughout Europe for their superior metallurgy and craftsmanship. They created intricate jewelry and decorative objects that appealed to wealthy customers in foreign markets. They processed raw materials like amber and walrus ivory that were abundant in Scandinavia but rare elsewhere. But here's where Viking trading becomes absolutely remarkable. These expeditions weren't just about exchanging goods for profit. They were complex diplomatic and cultural missions that required sophisticated social skills and political awareness. Viking traders had to navigate foreign legal systems, establish relationships with local authorities, and adapt to completely different cultural practices. Think about what this actually meant for a Viking trader's daily routine during these expeditions. They might spend weeks traveling through foreign territories where they didn't speak the local language and weren't familiar with local customs. They had to establish trust with potential customers, who might view them with suspicion or hostility. They had to negotiate complex deals that involved not just immediate exchanges, but also long-term credit arrangements and future obligations. The successful Viking traders were essentially international diplomats who understood multiple languages, legal systems, and cultural practices. They maintained detailed mental records of market conditions, political relationships, and business opportunities across vast geographic regions. They served as unofficial ambassadors for their home communities and played crucial roles in establishing peaceful relationships between different cultures. During the winter months when long-distance travel was impossible, Viking daily life shifted dramatically toward indoor activities that were equally demanding, but completely different in character. The long, dark winter wasn't a period of rest and relaxation. It was an intensive period of craft production, social activity, and preparation for the following year. Viking households used the winter months to produce the goods they would trade during the following summer. This meant that their homes became bustling workshops where multiple generations worked together on complex production projects. The women would spend countless hours at their looms creating the high-quality textiles that were essential trade goods. The men would work on weapon production, tool maintenance, and woodworking projects that required careful attention and couldn't be rushed. But winter work wasn't just about production. It was also about education and social bonding that held Viking communities together. The long evening hours provided opportunities for intensive teaching and learning that were impossible during the busy summer months. Master craftsmen would pass down their specialized knowledge to younger apprentices. Experienced farmers would share their understanding of agricultural techniques and animal husbandry with the next generation. The storytelling traditions that happened during winter evenings served multiple important functions that went far beyond entertainment. These stories preserved essential historical information about family genealogies, legal precedents, and cultural values. They taught moral lessons about proper behavior and social obligations. They maintained connections between Viking communities that might be separated by hundreds of miles during the winter months. Young Vikings learned to recite complex poems and sagas that could take hours to perform completely. They memorized intricate genealogies that traced family relationships back multiple generations. They learned legal codes and procedures that would enable them to participate effectively in community decision-making processes. This oral education was absolutely essential because Viking society had very limited written records and depended on human memory to preserve crucial information. The winter months also provided opportunities for Viking communities to engage in complex legal and political processes that required extensive discussion and negotiation. Viking society was remarkably democratic for its time, with important decisions made through assemblies where free men could participate in debates and vote on community issues. These assemblies weren't simple meetings where decisions were made quickly. They were elaborate processes that could last for days or weeks and involved detailed discussions of legal precedents, community needs, and individual rights. Vikings had sophisticated legal codes that covered everything from property disputes to criminal offences to family relationships. The daily preparation for these assemblies required extensive research and consultation. Viking men would spend hours discussing legal precedents with their elders, researching genealogical information that might be relevant to specific cases, and building coalitions to support their positions on important issues. The legal knowledge required to participate effectively in these assemblies was enormous and required years of study and practice. Viking women, while not directly participating in the formal assembly processes, played crucial roles in the political activities that surrounded these events. They managed the complex hospitality obligations that were essential to Viking political culture. They organized feasts and social gatherings that provided opportunities for informal negotiations and relationship building. They maintained the social networks that were essential to effective political participation. The feast preparation alone was a massive undertaking that required weeks of planning and coordination. Viking hospitality was legendary, and hosts were expected to provide elaborate entertainment for their guests. This meant preparing enormous quantities of food and drink, organizing sleeping arrangements for dozens of visitors, and creating entertainment programs that could last for several days. These feasts weren't just social events. They were crucial political and economic institutions that strengthened alliances between families and communities. The quality of hospitality that a Viking household could provide was a direct indicator of their wealth and social status. Families would invest enormous resources in these events because the political benefits could last for generations. The brewing activities that supported these feasts represent another sophisticated aspect of Viking daily life that required specialized knowledge and careful timing. Vikings were master brewers who created various types of alcoholic beverages from available ingredients. They brewed ale from barley and other grains using techniques that produced consistent, high-quality results. They created mead from honey using fermentation processes that required precise control of temperature and timing. The brewing process itself was a complex operation that required months of preparation and careful attention to detail. Vikings had to maintain proper equipment, manage ingredient supplies, and control fermentation conditions to produce beverages that met their high standards. The finished products weren't just for consumption, they were valuable trade goods and essential elements of social relationships. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking daily life was how they managed to maintain their cultural identity and social cohesion despite being spread across enormous geographic distances and facing constant challenges from hostile neighbors and harsh environmental conditions. Viking families maintained connections with relatives and allies who might live hundreds of miles away through an elaborate system of mutual obligations and regular communication. They sent messages through traveling merchants and visiting relatives. They participated in seasonal gatherings that brought together people from multiple communities. They maintained detailed genealogical records that enabled them to identify distant relatives and establish new relationships. The marriage arrangements that connected Viking families across these vast distances required sophisticated negotiation and planning processes that could take years to complete. Viking marriages weren't just personal relationships. They were political and economic alliances that affected entire communities. The negotiation process involved detailed discussions of property rights, inheritance arrangements, and ongoing obligations between families. Young Vikings often traveled extensively before marriage to learn about opportunities in different regions and to establish the personal relationships that would be crucial to their future success. These travels weren't casual adventures. They were carefully planned educational experiences that provided young people with the knowledge and connections they would need as adults. The religious and spiritual aspects of Viking daily life were deeply integrated into all of these practical activities in ways that modern people often struggle to understand. Vikings didn't separate their spiritual beliefs from their practical work. Instead, They saw their daily activities as expressions of their relationship with the gods and the natural world. Viking farmers performed rituals and offerings that were designed to ensure good harvests and protect their livestock. They timed their agricultural activities according to religious calendars that connected their work with seasonal festivals and spiritual observances. They understood their farming as participation in the cosmic cycles that governed all life. Viking craftsmen dedicated their work to specific gods who were believed to provide inspiration and protection for different types of activities. Blacksmiths honored the gods associated with fire and metalworking. Sailors made offerings to the gods who controlled winds and seas. Warriors sought the favor of gods who governed battle and courage. These religious observances weren't separate from daily work. They were integrated into the regular routines that governed Viking life throughout the year. Vikings began important projects with ritual offerings and prayers. They marked significant achievements with celebrations that honored the gods. They understood their successes and failures as reflections of their relationships with divine powers. The seasonal festivals that marked important points in the Viking calendar required extensive preparation and community participation. These weren't simple celebrations. They were complex religious and social events that reinforced community bonds and renewed spiritual commitments. Families would spend weeks preparing special foods, creating decorative items, and organizing entertainment for these festivals. The spring festivals that marked the beginning of the agricultural season involved elaborate ceremonies that blessed the fields and livestock for the coming year. The harvest festivals that celebrated successful crops included complex rituals that honored the gods and shared the community's good fortune with all members. The winter solstice celebrations that marked the darkest point of the year provided hope and encouragement during the most challenging season. These festivals also served important economic and political functions that went beyond their religious significance. They provided opportunities for families from different communities to meet and establish business relationships. They facilitated marriages between young people from different regions. They enabled the exchange of information about political developments and economic opportunities. The daily preparation for these seasonal festivals required the same careful planning and resource management that characterized all aspects of Viking life. Families had to accumulate the resources necessary to participate fully in the celebrations. They had to coordinate their activities with other community members. They had to balance their festival obligations with their regular work responsibilities. What emerges from this detailed examination of Viking daily life is a picture of incredibly sophisticated people who managed complex social, economic, and spiritual systems while dealing with some of the harshest environmental conditions in medieval Europe. Their daily routines weren't random or chaotic. They were carefully structured systems that enabled not just survival, but prosperity and cultural achievement. The integration of all these different aspects of Viking life into coherent daily routines required remarkable organizational skills and cultural knowledge that was passed down through generations of practical experience. Every Viking adult understood their role in maintaining the complex systems that supported their community's survival and prosperity. But there's still more to this story that will completely change how you understand Viking society, because what I've described so far is just the foundation. The real genius of Viking culture was how they used these daily routines to build something much larger and more ambitious than simple survival. The truth is, Vikings used their sophisticated daily routines as launching pads for something that would reshape the medieval world completely. Every single task I just described, from morning animal checks to wintercraft production, was designed to create surplus wealth and specialized skills that enabled Vikings to pursue their most ambitious projects. Think about this for a moment. A Viking household that had mastered efficient farming techniques, textile production, and craft specialization wasn't just surviving. They were generating resources that could be invested in larger ventures that required significant capital and expertise. The daily routines weren't the end goal. they were the foundation for building something much more significant. This is where Viking daily life becomes absolutely fascinating, because their regular routines were specifically designed to support the massive undertakings that made Vikings legendary throughout medieval Europe. Those perfectly timed agricultural cycles weren't just about feeding their families. They were about creating food surpluses that could support extended expeditions lasting months or even years. The textile work that consumed so much of women's time wasn't just about clothing their households. They were producing high-quality sails, ropes, and protective gear that enabled Viking ships to travel distances that seemed impossible to other medieval cultures. A single Viking longship required sails that took months to weave and represented enormous investments of time and skill. The metalworking skills that Viking blacksmiths developed through their daily routines enabled them to create weapons and tools that were superior to anything available elsewhere in medieval Europe. These weren't just functional items. They were technological innovations that gave Vikings decisive advantages in both peaceful trade and military conflicts. But here's what makes this really remarkable. Vikings didn't just use their daily routines to prepare for individual expeditions. They created systematic approaches to exploration and expansion that required coordination between multiple communities across vast distances. Their daily life was designed to support a culture of exploration that would eventually reach North America, the Mediterranean, and deep into Eastern Europe. The ship construction alone reveals the incredible sophistication of Viking planning and organization. A typical Viking longship required resources and expertise from dozens of different specialists. The shipwrights who designed and built the vessels needed years of training and access to specialized tools. The woodworkers who provided the timber had to understand which trees would provide the strongest and most flexible wood. The blacksmiths who created the metal fittings had to produce items that could withstand the stresses of ocean voyages. But building the ships was just the beginning. Vikings had to develop navigation techniques that enabled them to travel across open oceans without modern instruments. They created sophisticated methods for reading weather patterns, ocean currents, and celestial movements. They understood how to use birds, watercolor, and wave patterns to identify land that was still beyond the horizon. This navigation knowledge wasn't something that individual Vikings developed on their own. It was accumulated cultural wisdom that was preserved and transmitted through the same oral traditions that governed other aspects of their daily life. Master navigators spent years teaching their skills to younger Vikings who would eventually lead their own expeditions. The provisioning for these long-distance voyages required the same careful planning and resource management that characterized Viking daily life. Expedition leaders had to calculate exactly how much food and water would be needed for journeys that could last several months. They had to select crew members who had the specific skills that would be essential for success. They had to pack tools, weapons, and trade goods that would enable them to establish new settlements or trading relationships. Think about what this meant for Viking communities that were organizing these expeditions. They had to be willing to invest enormous resources in ventures that had no guaranteed return. They had to send their most skilled and experienced people on dangerous journeys that might result in permanent separation from their families. They had to maintain their regular daily routines while also supporting these ambitious projects. The settlement activities that Vikings pursued in new territories required even more sophisticated planning and coordination than their trading expeditions. When Vikings decided to establish permanent settlements in places like Iceland, Greenland, or North America, they weren't just sending out small groups of adventurers. They were organizing massive logistical operations that required years of preparation. These settlement expeditions had to include people with all the essential skills needed to establish functioning communities in completely unknown environments. They needed farmers who could adapt their agricultural techniques to new soil and climate conditions. They needed craftsmen who could maintain and repair tools and equipment far from any source of replacement. They needed leaders who could organize communities and resolve disputes without access to traditional legal institutions. The women who participated in these settlement expeditions faced particularly challenging responsibilities. They had to maintain all of their traditional household management duties while adapting to completely unfamiliar environments. They had to preserve and transmit cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost in the process of establishing new communities. They had to raise children who would be culturally Viking, but who would never see the Scandinavian homelands. The daily routines that these Viking settlers established in new territories had to balance maintaining their cultural identity with adapting to new environmental conditions. They couldn't simply replicate the daily routines that worked in Scandinavia because the climate, geography, and available resources were often completely different. For example, Viking settlers in Iceland had to develop new approaches to agriculture because the growing season was even shorter and the soil conditions were different from what they had known in Norway or Denmark. They had to learn to exploit new resources, like geothermal energy, that weren't available in their homelands. They had to develop new building techniques that could withstand volcanic activity and extreme weather conditions. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about these Viking settlements. Despite being separated by thousands of miles and facing completely different environmental challenges, they maintained cultural connections with their Scandinavian origins that lasted for centuries. They preserved the same oral traditions, legal codes, and social structures that governed daily life in their homelands. This cultural preservation required deliberate effort and systematic approaches that were integrated into their daily routines. Viking settlers made sure that their children learned the same stories, songs, and genealogies that connected them to their extended family networks. They maintained the same religious observances and seasonal festivals that marked important points in the cultural calendar. They continued to produce the same types of crafts and decorative arts that expressed their cultural identity. The trading relationships that connected these distant Viking settlements with their homelands and with other Viking communities required incredible dedication and risk-taking. Vikings regularly traveled thousands of miles to maintain commercial and family relationships that were essential to their cultural survival. These long-distance trading networks enabled Viking settlements to access resources and expertise that weren't available locally. A Viking community in Greenland could obtain iron tools and weapons from Scandinavia in exchange for walrus ivory and polar bear furs that were highly valued in European markets. A Viking settlement in Ireland could provide their relatives in Norway with access to new agricultural techniques and exotic goods from the Mediterranean world. But maintaining these trading relationships required enormous investments of time and resources that had to be generated through efficient daily routines. Viking communities had to produce surplus goods that were valuable enough to justify long-distance transportation. They had to maintain ships and equipment that could survive ocean voyages lasting several months. They had to develop the specialized knowledge needed to navigate between distant regions. The cultural exchange that resulted from these extensive trading networks had profound impacts on Viking daily life that extended far beyond simple commercial relationships. Vikings encountered new technologies, agricultural techniques, and cultural practices that they adapted and integrated into their own daily routines. For example, Vikings who traded in the Mediterranean world learned about new food preservation techniques, architectural styles, and decorative arts that they brought back to their home communities. Vikings who established settlements in the British Isles adopted local agricultural practices and building techniques that proved superior to their traditional methods. Vikings who travelled into Eastern Europe encountered new metalworking techniques and religious ideas that influenced their cultural development. This cultural adaptability was one of the most remarkable characteristics of Viking society, and it was directly connected to the flexibility and efficiency of their daily routines. Vikings were able to adopt new practices and technologies because their cultural systems were designed to accommodate change and innovation while preserving essential core values and relationships. The military activities that made Vikings famous throughout medieval Europe were also direct extensions of their sophisticated daily routines and organizational systems. Viking military expeditions weren't spontaneous outbursts of violence. They were carefully planned operations that required the same systematic approach and resource management that characterized all aspects of Viking life. A typical Viking military expedition began with months of preparation that involved entire communities. Leaders had to assess potential targets and evaluate the risks and benefits of different strategies. They had to recruit warriors who had the necessary skills and experience for specific types of operations. They had to accumulate weapons, equipment, and supplies that would enable their forces to operate effectively far from their home bases. The warrior training that prepared Vikings for these military expeditions was integrated into their regular daily routines from childhood. Young Viking men learned weapon skills alongside their agricultural and craft training. They practiced fighting techniques during seasonal festivals and community gatherings. They developed the physical fitness and mental toughness needed for combat through the demanding work that characterized Viking daily life. But Viking military culture wasn't just about individual fighting skills. It was about creating coordinated tactical systems that could function effectively under extreme stress. Viking warriors had to learn to fight as disciplined units that could execute complex maneuvers and adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The shield wall formations that Vikings used in major battles required extensive practice and coordination between warriors who might come from different communities and have limited experience fighting together. The naval tactics that made Viking longships so effective required seamless cooperation between crews that had to manage sails, oars, and weapons simultaneously while navigating dangerous waters. These military skills were developed and maintained through the same systematic approaches that governed other aspects of Viking culture. Communities organized regular training exercises that brought together warriors from different households. They held competitions and contests that encouraged the development of fighting skills and tactical knowledge. They preserved military traditions and strategies through oral histories that recorded successful techniques and cautionary tales about failed expeditions. The economic motivations that drove Viking military activities were directly connected to the resource management systems that governed their daily life. Viking communities that had reached the limits of their local agricultural capacity needed access to new resources that could only be obtained through expansion or conquest. The wealth that Vikings accumulated through successful military expeditions enabled them to support larger populations and more ambitious projects. The tribute and plunder that they extracted from conquered territories provided resources that could be invested in new settlements, trading expeditions, and cultural developments. But Viking military activities also created obligations and responsibilities that had to be managed through their daily routines. Successful Viking leaders had to distribute wealth fairly among their followers. They had to maintain military forces that could defend their territories against retaliation. They had to establish administrative systems that could govern conquered populations effectively. The political systems that Vikings developed to manage these complex responsibilities were extensions of the democratic assemblies and legal codes that governed their home communities. Viking leaders couldn't simply impose their will through force. They had to maintain the support of their followers through effective leadership and fair distribution of benefits. The royal courts that emerged in Viking kingdoms during the later medieval period were essentially enlarged versions of the household management systems that governed individual Viking farms. Kings and jarls had to manage resources, coordinate activities between different groups, and maintain relationships with allies and rivals using the same basic principles that governed family-level decision-making. The cultural achievements that Vikings produced during their most successful periods were direct results of the wealth and expertise that they accumulated through their systematic daily routines. The magnificent art, literature, and architecture that characterized Viking culture at its peak required resources and skills that could only be developed through generations of efficient organization and cultural preservation. The saga literature that preserves Viking stories and values represents one of the most sophisticated literary traditions in medieval Europe. These complex narratives required enormous cultural knowledge and artistic skill to create and preserve. They could only exist in a society that had developed systematic approaches to education and cultural transmission. The architectural achievements of Viking culture, from the great halls of Norwegian kings to the sophisticated churches of medieval Iceland, required engineering knowledge and construction skills that were developed through centuries of practical experience. The decorative arts that adorned Viking weapons, jewelry, and household items required artistic traditions that were preserved and refined through systematic apprenticeship programs. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Viking culture was their ability to maintain cultural coherence and identity across enormous geographic distances and dramatic environmental differences. Vikings in Greenland, Sicily, and the Volga River shared fundamental cultural values and practices, despite being separated by thousands of miles and facing completely different survival challenges. This cultural achievement was only possible because Vikings had developed daily routines and social systems that could preserve essential knowledge while adapting to new circumstances. Their oral traditions, legal codes, and social structures were flexible enough to accommodate change while maintaining the core relationships and values that defined Viking identity. The legacy of Viking daily life extends far beyond the medieval period, into the foundations of modern Scandinavian culture and beyond. The democratic institutions, legal traditions, and cultural values that characterize modern Nordic societies have direct connections to the systematic approaches that governed Viking daily life over 1,000 years ago. The exploration traditions that led Vikings to North America centuries before Columbus established patterns of innovation and adventure that continue to characterize Scandinavian culture today. The trading networks that connected Viking communities across vast distances created commercial and cultural relationships that evolved into modern international systems. But the most important lesson from Viking daily life might be how they created sustainable systems that could support both individual prosperity and collective achievement. Their daily routines weren't just about survival. They were about building something larger and more meaningful than individual existence while maintaining the cultural values and relationships that gave their lives purpose and direction. The integration of practical work, cultural preservation, and ambitious expansion that characterized Viking daily life offers insights that remain relevant for modern people facing their own challenges of balancing individual needs with collective responsibilities. Vikings understood that sustainable success required systematic approaches that could support both immediate needs and long-term goals. Their story demonstrates that remarkable achievements are possible when people organize their daily routines around clear purposes and maintain the discipline needed to pursue those purposes consistently over extended periods. The Vikings who woke up before dawn to check their livestock weren't just farmers. They were participants in a cultural system that would reshape the medieval world and create legacies that continue to influence modern society. But there's still one more aspect of Viking daily life that reveals the true genius of their cultural system, and it's something that most people never consider when they think about these legendary Norse people. It's the aspect that explains how Vikings managed to maintain their remarkable achievements across multiple generations, and how their daily routines created sustainable prosperity that could survive the dramatic changes that characterize medieval Europe. The secret lies in how Vikings approached what we might call generational wealth building, but it was far more sophisticated than simple inheritance or property transfer. Vikings understood that true prosperity required creating systems that could adapt and evolve while preserving essential knowledge and relationships across multiple generations. Think about this from the perspective of a Viking family planning for their children's future. They couldn't just accumulate gold and land and expect that to guarantee long-term success. The harsh Scandinavian environment, political instability, and constant technological changes meant that static wealth could disappear overnight. Instead, Vikings focused on building what we might call adaptive capacity in their children and communities. This generational planning was embedded in every aspect of their daily routines in ways that modern people rarely understand. When a Viking father taught his son to read weather patterns and ocean currents, he wasn't just passing on navigation skills. He was teaching systematic observation and analysis techniques that could be applied to any new challenge or opportunity. When a Viking mother taught her daughter complex textile patterns, she was developing pattern recognition and precision skills that would prove valuable in countless future situations. The apprenticeship systems that governed Viking education were designed to create people who could innovate and adapt rather than simply repeat established procedures. Young Vikings learned the underlying principles that governed successful farming, craftsmanship, and trading, rather than just memorizing specific techniques. This meant that when they encountered new environments or opportunities, they could develop new approaches based on solid foundational knowledge. The oral traditions that preserved Viking cultural knowledge were structured to enable continuous updating and refinement rather than rigid preservation of outdated information. Viking stories and genealogies weren't just historical records. They were dynamic teaching tools that could incorporate new experiences and lessons while maintaining essential cultural values and relationships. For example, when a Viking trading expedition discovered new markets or encountered new challenges, those experiences would be integrated into the traditional stories that were told during winter evening gatherings. Young Vikings would learn not just what their ancestors had accomplished, but how they had adapted to changing circumstances and overcome unexpected obstacles. This approach to cultural preservation created what modern organizational theorists might call institutional memory that could evolve and improve over time. Viking communities accumulated wisdom and expertise across multiple generations while remaining flexible enough to respond effectively to new challenges and opportunities. The marriage and kinship systems that connected Viking families across vast distances were designed to create resilient networks that could survive political upheavals, economic disruptions, and environmental disasters. When Vikings arranged marriages between families from different regions, they weren't just creating personal relationships. They were building redundant support systems that could provide assistance and resources during difficult periods. A Viking family that faced crop failures in their home region could rely on relatives in other areas who might have had successful harvests. A Viking community that lost key craftsmen to disease or warfare could recruit replacements through their extended kinship networks. These relationships weren't just social connections. They were essential survival mechanisms that enabled Viking communities to recover from setbacks that would have destroyed less well-connected societies. The resource management strategies that governed Viking daily life were specifically designed to create buffers and alternatives that could handle unexpected disruptions. Viking families didn't just accumulate enough resources for their immediate needs. They systematically built surplus capacity that could support extended family members, community obligations, and unexpected opportunities or challenges. But here's what makes this really fascinating. Vikings understood that true security came not from hoarding resources, but from maintaining productive relationships and capabilities that could generate new resources when needed. A Viking household that invested in developing superior craftsmanship skills was more secure than one that simply accumulated finished goods, because the skills could create new wealth, even if the goods were lost or stolen. The diversification strategies that characterized Viking economic activities were remarkably sophisticated for their time period. Most Viking families participated in multiple economic sectors simultaneously, rather than specializing in single activities. They combined farming, craftsmanship, trading, and sometimes military activities in ways that provided multiple income sources and reduced their vulnerability to disruptions in any single sector. This economic diversification wasn't random or accidental. It was a deliberate strategy that was integrated into their daily routines and cultural values. Viking children learned multiple skills, not just because their society needed people who could perform various tasks, but because families understood that flexibility and adaptability were essential for long-term prosperity. The seasonal rhythms that governed Viking daily life created natural cycles of intense activity and strategic planning that enabled communities to respond quickly to new opportunities or challenges. During the busy summer months, Vikings focused on immediate production and resource accumulation. During the quieter winter periods, they engaged in strategic planning, relationship building, and skill development that prepared them for future activities. This cyclical approach to activity and planning created sustainable work patterns that could be maintained over extended periods without causing burnout or resource depletion. Vikings understood that sustainable success required balancing periods of intense effort with periods of recovery and preparation. The community cooperation systems that enabled Vikings to accomplish massive projects like ship construction or settlement expeditions were based on reciprocal obligations and shared benefits that created long-term stability and trust. When a Viking community organized a trading expedition or military campaign, the benefits weren't concentrated among a small elite. They were distributed among all participants in ways that strengthened community bonds and encouraged future cooperation. These cooperation systems created what modern economists would recognize as positive feedback loops that reinforce successful behaviors and discourage destructive competition. Viking communities that developed effective cooperation mechanisms became more prosperous and powerful, which attracted additional members and resources, which enabled even more ambitious projects and greater success. The conflict resolution mechanisms that governed Viking legal and political systems were designed to preserve relationships and community cohesion rather than simply punishing wrongdoers. Viking assemblies focused on finding solutions that could restore social harmony and prevent future problems, rather than just determining guilt and assigning punishment. This approach to conflict resolution was essential for maintaining the cooperative relationships that Viking communities depended on for survival and prosperity. In a society where everyone was dependent on everyone else for essential services and support, destroying relationships through harsh punishments would have been counterproductive and ultimately self-defeating. The technological innovation that characterized Viking culture emerged naturally from their systematic approaches to problem-solving and knowledge sharing. Vikings didn't just preserve existing techniques and technologies. They continuously refined and improved them through systematic experimentation and careful observation of results. The shipbuilding innovations that made Viking longships superior to other medieval vessels weren't sudden breakthroughs created by individual geniuses. They were the result of generations of systematic improvements made by craftsmen who carefully tested new techniques and shared their discoveries with other builders throughout the Viking world. The agricultural innovations that enabled Vikings to thrive in marginal environments were similarly developed through systematic experimentation and knowledge sharing. Viking farmers continuously tested new crop varieties, soil preparation techniques, and livestock management practices. Successful innovations were rapidly adopted by other communities through the trading and kinship networks that connected Viking settlements across vast distances. The military innovations that made Viking forces so effective weren't just superior weapons and tactics. They were systematic approaches to training, organization, and logistics that enabled Viking armies to operate effectively far from their home bases and adapt quickly to new challenges and opportunities. Viking military leaders understood that sustainable military success required more than just winning individual battles. They needed to create systems that could maintain effective forces over extended periods and adapt to changing political and technological conditions. This required the same systematic approach to planning and resource management that characterized other aspects of Viking culture. The cultural innovations that enabled Vikings to maintain their identity while adapting to new environments were perhaps their most remarkable achievement. Vikings developed cultural transmission systems that could preserve essential values and relationships while encouraging innovation and adaptation to new circumstances. This cultural flexibility enabled Viking communities to thrive in environments as diverse as the Arctic tundra of Greenland, the fertile farmlands of northern France, and the river systems of Eastern Europe. They maintained recognizably Viking cultural characteristics while developing region-specific adaptations that enabled them to compete successfully with established local populations. The educational systems that prepared young Vikings for adult responsibilities were designed to develop creative problem-solving abilities rather than just technical skills. Viking children learned to analyze new situations, identify essential principles, and develop innovative solutions rather than simply memorizing established procedures. This educational approach created adults who could adapt effectively to new challenges and opportunities, rather than just repeating familiar patterns. When Vikings encountered new environments or technologies, they could quickly understand the underlying principles and develop appropriate adaptations rather than being limited by their previous experience. The religious and spiritual systems that governed Viking daily life provided meaning and motivation that sustained them through difficult periods, while encouraging the risk-taking and innovation that characterized their most impressive achievements. Viking religious beliefs emphasized personal responsibility, courage, and honor in ways that supported both individual initiative and community cooperation. The Viking concept of fate wasn't passive acceptance of predetermined outcomes. It was an active engagement with challenging circumstances that emphasized making the most of available opportunities while accepting responsibility for the consequences of personal choices. This philosophical approach encouraged Vikings to pursue ambitious goals while maintaining realistic assessments of risks and benefits. The seasonal festivals and religious observances that marked important points in the Viking calendar weren't just social celebrations. They were systematic renewal processes that reinforced community bonds, celebrated achievements, and prepared for future challenges. These events provided opportunities for communities to assess their progress, share knowledge and resources, and coordinate plans for future activities. The artistic and literary traditions that preserved Viking cultural values weren't just entertainment or decoration. They were sophisticated communication systems that transmitted complex knowledge about successful strategies, cautionary lessons, and cultural values across generations and geographic distances. The elaborate decorative patterns that adorned Viking weapons, jewelry, and household items weren't just aesthetic expressions. They were symbolic systems that communicated information about family relationships, social status, and cultural affiliations. These artistic traditions enabled Vikings to maintain cultural connections and shared identities even when they were separated by vast distances and different environmental conditions. The storytelling traditions that preserved Viking history and values weren't just entertainment for winter evenings. They were systematic educational programs that taught essential knowledge about successful strategies, social relationships, and cultural values. These stories provided templates for decision-making and behavior that enabled Vikings to respond effectively to new challenges and opportunities. The legal traditions that governed Viking communities weren't just rules for resolving disputes. They were systematic approaches to maintaining social cooperation and preventing destructive conflicts. Viking legal codes emphasized restoration and prevention rather than punishment, which helped preserve the relationships and trust that were essential for community survival and prosperity. The trading protocols that governed Viking commercial activities weren't just business procedures. They were diplomatic systems that enabled peaceful interaction between different cultures and communities. Viking merchants served as informal ambassadors who established relationships and shared information that facilitated peaceful cooperation and cultural exchange. The settlement strategies that enabled Vikings to establish successful communities in new territories weren't just military conquests or random migrations. They were systematic colonization programs that carefully balanced maintaining cultural identity with adapting to new environmental and social conditions. Viking settlers understood that successful colonization required more than just establishing physical presence in new territories. They needed to create sustainable communities that could thrive independently while maintaining beneficial relationships with their homelands and neighboring populations. This required the same systematic approach to planning and resource management that characterized all aspects of Viking culture. The integration of all these different systems into coherent daily routines that could support both individual prosperity and community achievement represents one of the most sophisticated organizational accomplishments in medieval history. Vikings created cultural systems that were simultaneously stable and adaptive, traditional and innovative, local and international. Their daily routines weren't just about survival or even prosperity. They were about creating sustainable systems that could support human flourishing across multiple generations, while adapting to changing circumstances and new opportunities. The Vikings who woke up before dawn to check their livestock were participating in cultural systems that would influence the development of modern civilization in ways that continue to affect our world today. But there's one final aspect of Viking daily life that reveals the ultimate source of their remarkable achievements. And it's something that connects their thousand-year-old wisdom directly to challenges that modern people face in our rapidly changing world. It's the aspect that explains why some societies thrive during periods of dramatic change, while others collapse under similar pressures. The secret that enabled Vikings to thrive during one of history's most turbulent periods was their understanding of what we might call dynamic equilibrium. They created daily routines that were structured enough to provide stability and efficiency, but flexible enough to accommodate rapid changes and unexpected opportunities. Think about this from a systems perspective. Most medieval societies created rigid hierarchies and inflexible traditions that worked well under stable conditions, but collapsed when faced with significant disruptions. Vikings developed something completely different. They built adaptive systems that actually became stronger and more effective when challenged by change and uncertainty. This dynamic equilibrium was embedded in every aspect of their daily routines through principles that modern complexity theorists would recognize as sophisticated organizational design. Vikings understood intuitively that sustainable systems require constant feedback loops, redundant capabilities, and distributed decision-making authority that can respond quickly to changing conditions. For example, the household management systems that governed Viking daily life weren't based on rigid role assignments that never changed. Instead, family members learned multiple skills and could shift responsibilities based on seasonal needs, health conditions, or unexpected opportunities. When the primary farmer was injured or called away for trading expeditions, other family members could maintain essential agricultural activities without disrupting the overall system. This flexibility extended throughout their entire social structure in ways that created remarkable resilience and adaptability. Viking communities could lose key leaders, suffer environmental disasters, or face military threats without experiencing complete system collapse because essential functions were distributed among multiple people who understood the underlying principles rather than just specific procedures. The resource allocation strategies that governed Viking economic activities demonstrated this same principle of dynamic equilibrium. Rather than creating elaborate storage systems for accumulated wealth, Vikings focused on maintaining productive capacity that could generate resources when needed. They understood that skills, relationships, and knowledge were more valuable than static assets because they could create new wealth even when existing resources were lost or stolen. This approach to wealth creation enabled Viking communities to recover quickly from setbacks that would have permanently crippled societies that depended on accumulated material resources When Viking settlements were destroyed by natural disasters or military attacks, survivors could rebuild relatively quickly because they retained the human capital and social relationships needed to recreate their productive systems. The communication networks that connected Viking communities across vast distances operated on similar principles of distributed resilience and adaptive capacity. Rather than depending on centralized information systems that could be disrupted by single points of failure, Vikings created redundant communication networks that could continue functioning even when individual links were broken. Traveling merchants, visiting relatives, seasonal workers, and military expeditions all served as information carriers who could transmit essential news and knowledge between communities that might be separated by hundreds of miles. This distributed communication system enabled Viking communities to coordinate activities, share innovations, and respond collectively to threats or opportunities, even when formal political structures were disrupted. The decision-making processes that governed Viking communities reflected this same understanding of dynamic systems and adaptive capacity. Rather than concentrating authority in single leaders who might be absent or incapacitated during critical moments, Vikings distributed decision-making responsibility among multiple people who understood community needs and priorities. The assembly systems that governed Viking legal and political processes weren't just democratic institutions. They were distributed intelligence networks that could process complex information, evaluate multiple options, and reach effective decisions even when facing unprecedented situations. These assemblies drew on the collective knowledge and experience of entire communities rather than depending on the wisdom of individual leaders. This distributed approach to leadership and decision-making created what modern organizational theorists would recognize as learning organizations that could continuously improve their performance by incorporating new information and adapting their strategies based on changing circumstances. Viking communities that encountered new challenges or opportunities could quickly develop innovative responses by drawing on their collective intelligence and experience. The skill development systems that prepared Vikings for adult responsibilities were designed to create what we might call adaptive expertise rather than just technical competence. Young Vikings learned underlying principles and problem-solving approaches that could be applied to new situations, rather than just memorizing specific procedures that might become obsolete. This educational approach created adults who could innovate and adapt rather than just execute established routines. When Vikings encountered new environments, technologies, or social systems, they could quickly understand the essential dynamics and develop appropriate strategies rather than being limited by their previous experience. The cultural preservation systems that maintained Viking identity across multiple generations and geographic regions operated on similar principles of adaptive continuity. Vikings preserved essential values and relationships while encouraging innovation and adaptation that enabled them to thrive in changing circumstances. The oral traditions that transmitted Viking cultural knowledge weren't rigid scripts that had to be repeated exactly. They were flexible frameworks that could incorporate new experiences and insights while maintaining essential cultural themes and values. This enabled Viking culture to evolve and adapt while preserving the core identity that connected communities across vast distances and different circumstances. The religious and spiritual systems that provided meaning and motivation for Viking daily activities reflected the same understanding of dynamic balance between stability and change. Viking religious beliefs emphasize both honoring traditional relationships with gods and ancestors, while accepting responsibility for adapting to new circumstances and pursuing ambitious goals. The concept of weird or fate that governed Viking decision-making wasn't passive acceptance of predetermined outcomes. It was an active engagement with uncertain circumstances that emphasized making optimal choices based on available information, while accepting that outcomes couldn't be completely controlled or predicted. This philosophical approach enabled Vikings to pursue high-risk, high-reward strategies without being paralyzed by uncertainty or fear of failure. They understood that sustainable success required taking calculated risks and learning from both successes and failures rather than trying to avoid all uncertainty and change. The seasonal rhythms that governed Viking daily activities created natural cycles of focused activity and strategic reflection that enabled continuous improvement and adaptation. During busy periods, Vikings focused on execution and immediate results. During quieter periods, they evaluated their performance, planned improvements, and prepared for future challenges. This cyclical approach to activity and planning created sustainable patterns that could be maintained over extended periods while enabling continuous learning and adaptation. Vikings could maintain high performance levels without experiencing burnout or system degradation because they built recovery and renewal periods into their regular routines. The project management systems that enabled Vikings to accomplish massive undertakings like ship construction, settlement expeditions, and military campaigns reflected sophisticated understanding of complex systems coordination. These projects required integrating multiple specialized skills, coordinating activities across extended time periods, and managing resources efficiently while adapting to changing conditions. Viking project leaders understood that successful coordination required more than just detailed planning and rigid control. They needed to create systems that could adapt to unexpected problems, incorporate new information, and maintain momentum even when original assumptions proved incorrect. The quality control systems that governed Viking craft production demonstrated this same understanding of adaptive excellence. Viking craftsmen didn't just follow established procedures to create acceptable products. They continuously experimented with new techniques, materials, and designs, while maintaining the quality standards that made Viking products highly valued throughout medieval Europe. This approach to craftsmanship created what modern quality experts would recognize as continuous improvement systems that could enhance performance over time, rather than just maintaining existing standards. Viking craftsmen who discovered superior techniques shared their innovations with others, creating collective advancement that benefited entire communities. The risk management strategies that enabled Vikings to pursue ambitious expeditions and settlements reflected sophisticated understanding of uncertainty and probability. Vikings didn't avoid risks or try to eliminate all uncertainty. Instead, they developed systematic approaches to evaluating risks, minimizing downside consequences, and positioning themselves to benefit from positive outcomes. The diversification strategies that characterized Viking economic activities weren't just hedge against individual failures. They were systematic approaches to creating multiple pathways to success while building resilience against various types of disruption. Vikings understood that sustainable prosperity required maintaining multiple options and capabilities rather than depending on single strategies or resources. The alliance systems that connected Viking communities across vast distances operated on principles of mutual benefit and reciprocal obligation that created stable relationships while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. These alliances weren't rigid treaties that locked communities into predetermined responses. They were flexible partnerships that could evolve based on changing needs and opportunities. Viking alliance systems created what modern network theorists would recognize as scale-free networks that were simultaneously robust and adaptive. These networks could survive the loss of individual nodes while maintaining overall connectivity and functionality. They could also grow and evolve by incorporating new members and relationships without disrupting existing structures. The innovation systems that enabled Vikings to develop superior technologies and techniques reflected understanding of how knowledge creation and diffusion work in distributed networks. Viking innovations weren't the result of isolated genius or centralized research programs. They emerged from systematic experimentation and knowledge sharing that occurred throughout their cultural network. The shipbuilding innovations that made Viking vessels superior to other medieval ships resulted from generations of craftsmen who systematically tested new techniques, shared their discoveries, and built on each other's improvements. This distributed innovation process created technological advancement that was faster and more effective than centralized approaches. The agricultural innovations that enabled Vikings to thrive in marginal environments emerged from similar processes of distributed experimentation and knowledge sharing. Farmers throughout the Viking world continuously tested new techniques and shared successful innovations through the trading and kinship networks that connected their communities. The military innovations that made Viking forces effective weren't just superior weapons and tactics. They were systematic approaches to training, organization, and logistics that created adaptive capabilities rather than just static advantages. Viking military systems could evolve and improve based on experience while maintaining effectiveness against changing threats and opportunities. The social innovations that enabled Vikings to maintain cultural cohesion while adapting to diverse environments represented perhaps their most sophisticated achievement. They created social systems that were simultaneously stable and flexible, traditional and innovative, local and universal. These social innovations enabled Viking communities to maintain recognizable cultural characteristics while developing region-specific adaptations that allowed them to compete effectively with established local populations. They could preserve essential values and relationships while adopting beneficial practices and technologies from other cultures. The economic innovations that supported Viking prosperity and expansion created what modern economists would recognize as dynamic comparative advantages based on superior organizational capabilities rather than just natural resources or geographic position. Vikings created value through superior coordination, adaptation, and innovation rather than just exploiting existing advantages. The political innovations that governed Viking communities created democratic systems that were more flexible and responsive than the rigid hierarchies that characterized most medieval societies. These systems could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining legitimacy and effectiveness. The environmental adaptations that enabled Vikings to thrive in some of the world's most challenging climates demonstrated remarkable understanding of ecological systems and sustainable resource management. Vikings didn't just exploit their environments for short-term gain. They developed sustainable practices that could maintain productivity over extended periods while adapting to changing conditions. The cultural innovations that preserved Viking identity across multiple generations and diverse environments created what anthropologists would recognize as adaptive cultural systems that could evolve while maintaining core characteristics. These systems enabled Vikings to maintain cultural coherence while adapting to radically different circumstances. The technological innovations that supported Viking achievements in exploration, commerce, and military affairs created what historians recognize as technological systems that were more advanced and effective than anything else available in medieval Europe. These innovations weren't just individual improvements, but integrated systems that created synergistic advantages. The organizational innovations that coordinated Viking activities across vast distances and diverse environments created what management theorists would recognize as distributed organizations that could function effectively without centralized control or communication. These systems enabled Vikings to coordinate complex activities while maintaining local autonomy and adaptability. But perhaps the most important innovation that Vikings developed was their understanding of how to create sustainable systems that could support human flourishing while adapting to changing circumstances. They understood that true prosperity required more than just accumulating resources or achieving temporary advantages. Vikings created systems that were designed to last across multiple generations while remaining capable of evolution and adaptation. They built cultural systems that could preserve essential knowledge and relationships while encouraging innovation and growth. They developed economic systems that could generate sustainable prosperity while adapting to changing opportunities and challenges. The daily routines that governed Viking life weren't just efficient ways of accomplishing necessary tasks. They were systematic approaches to building and maintaining complex adaptive systems that could support human flourishing under challenging and changing conditions. When we examine Viking daily life through this lens of dynamic systems and adaptive capacity, we begin to understand why these remarkable people were able to achieve such extraordinary things while living in some of the world's most challenging environments. Their daily routines weren't just about survival or even prosperity. They were about creating sustainable systems that could support human potential while adapting to whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. The Vikings who woke up before dawn to check their livestock weren't just farmers performing routine tasks. They were participants in one of history's most sophisticated experiments in adaptive social organization. Their daily activities were components of integrated systems that enabled remarkable achievements, while maintaining the flexibility needed to thrive in an uncertain and rapidly changing world. Their legacy isn't just the exploration of new continents or the creation of impressive artifacts. It's the demonstration that human communities can create systems that are simultaneously stable and adaptive, traditional and innovative, local and global. They showed that it's possible to build sustainable prosperity that can endure across generations while remaining capable of evolution and growth. The principles that governed Viking daily life remain relevant for modern people, facing their own challenges of adapting to rapid change while maintaining essential values and relationships. Vikings understood something that many modern societies struggle to grasp. True resilience and prosperity come not from trying to control or eliminate change, but from developing systems that can adapt and thrive in changing circumstances. Their daily routines provide templates for creating sustainable success that doesn't depend on static advantages or rigid structures. They demonstrate how communities can build adaptive capacity that enables them to turn challenges into opportunities while preserving the values and relationships that make life meaningful. The remarkable story of what Vikings did all day reveals that their greatest achievement wasn't any single expedition or conquest. It was the creation of cultural systems that could support human flourishing across multiple generations while adapting to whatever circumstances they encountered. Their daily routines weren't just about getting through each day. They were about building something that could last while remaining capable of growth and evolution. In understanding how Vikings structured their daily lives, we gain insights not just into medieval history, but into fundamental principles of human organization that remain relevant for anyone seeking to build sustainable success in an uncertain and rapidly changing world. The Vikings who performed these daily routines understood something profound about the relationship between structure and flexibility, tradition and innovation, individual achievement, and collective prosperity. Their story demonstrates that remarkable achievements are possible when people organize their daily activities around clear purposes, while maintaining the adaptability needed to pursue those purposes effectively under changing conditions. The daily routines that enabled Vikings to reshape the medieval world offer timeless lessons about how to create systems that can support human potential while adapting to whatever challenges and opportunities the future may bring. The integration of all these sophisticated systems into daily Viking routines created something that modern organizational theorists would struggle to replicate, even with advanced technology and communication systems. Vikings managed to coordinate complex activities across thousands of miles using nothing more than human relationships, oral traditions, and carefully structured social obligations. But here's where this becomes absolutely mind-blowing. The daily routines that we've been exploring weren't just efficient ways of getting things done. They were systematic approaches to building what we might call cultural capital that could compound across generations like investment returns. Every single task that a Viking performed during their day was designed to create value that extended far beyond the immediate benefit. Think about this from the perspective of a Viking woman spending hours at her loom creating intricate textile patterns. She wasn't just making cloth for her family's immediate needs. She was developing skills that would make her valuable in marriage negotiations. She was creating trade goods that could be exchanged for resources her family couldn't produce locally. She was teaching techniques to her daughters that would enable them to support their own families. She was contributing to a reputation for quality that would benefit her entire community's trading relationships. The cumulative effect of these value-creating activities was extraordinary. Viking communities that consistently invested their daily efforts in building long-term capabilities became progressively more prosperous and influential over time. They created what economists would recognize as positive feedback loops, where success enabled greater success through improved capabilities and expanded opportunities. The morning animal care routines that began each Viking day perfectly illustrate this principle of compound value creation. When a Viking farmer carefully examined each animal for signs of illness or injury, he wasn't just protecting his immediate food supply. He was developing veterinary knowledge that would make him valuable to his neighbors. He was building a reputation for quality livestock that would increase the value of his animals in trade negotiations. He was teaching his children observational skills that would serve them throughout their lives. But the most remarkable aspect of these compound value systems was how they created what we might call network effects throughout Viking society. As individual households became more capable and prosperous through their systematic daily routines, the entire community became more attractive to potential trading partners, marriage allies, and settlement participants. Viking communities that had developed superior agricultural techniques could support larger populations, which enabled them to organize more ambitious expeditions and defend themselves more effectively against threats. Communities that had developed superior craftsmanship could command higher prices for their products, which provided resources for investment in new technologies and capabilities. Communities that had developed superior organizational skills could coordinate complex projects that created opportunities unavailable to less organized groups. These network effects meant that the benefits of systematic daily routines extended far beyond individual households to create competitive advantages for entire regions. Viking communities in areas that had developed particularly effective daily routines became centers of prosperity and influence that attracted resources and talent from throughout the medieval world. The seasonal festivals and religious observances that punctuated Viking daily routines served crucial functions in maintaining and amplifying these network effects. These gatherings weren't just social celebrations or spiritual observances. They were systematic knowledge-sharing and relationship-building events that enabled the entire community to benefit from individual innovations and achievements. During these festivals, Viking families would display their finest products and demonstrate their most advanced skills. Master craftsmen would share new techniques with apprentices from other households. Successful traders would describe new markets and opportunities they had discovered. Experienced farmers would discuss innovations they had developed for dealing with challenging growing conditions. But these knowledge-sharing activities weren't random or informal. They were structured processes that ensured valuable information reached the people who could best use it to benefit the entire community. Viking festivals included specific times and places for different types of knowledge-sharing activities. They had established protocols for recognizing and rewarding people who contributed valuable innovations or insights. The marriage negotiations that often occurred during these festivals demonstrate how Vikings used their social gatherings to optimize resource allocation and capability development throughout their communities. Viking marriages weren't just personal relationships. They were strategic alliances that combined complementary skills, resources, and social connections to create households that were more capable than either family could achieve independently. The negotiation process involved detailed assessments of what each family could contribute to the partnership and what they needed to achieve their long-term goals. Families with superior agricultural capabilities might ally with families that had developed advanced craftsmanship skills. Families with extensive trading connections might partner with families that had military expertise or political influence. These strategic marriages created what network theorists would recognize as small world networks, where most households were connected to each other through relatively short chains of family relationships. These networks enabled rapid information flow and resource sharing that benefited entire communities while maintaining the local autonomy that was essential to Viking cultural values. The legal and political processes that governed Viking communities were designed to maintain and strengthen these network relationships, while resolving conflicts that could disrupt community cooperation. Viking legal codes weren't just rules for punishing wrongdoers. They were systematic approaches to preserving relationships and preventing problems that could damage the social networks that enabled community prosperity. The assembly processes that made community decisions involved extensive consultation and deliberation that ensured all stakeholders understood and supported the outcomes. These weren't simple voting procedures where majorities imposed their will on minorities. They were consensus-building processes that created solutions everyone could live with while strengthening community bonds. But here's what makes Viking legal systems absolutely fascinating from a modern perspective. They understood something that many contemporary organizations struggle to grasp about the relationship between individual autonomy and collective cooperation. Viking legal codes protected individual rights and property while creating strong incentives for community participation and mutual support. Viking law recognized that sustainable communities required people who were both independent enough to contribute effectively and cooperative enough to work together toward common goals. Their legal systems created what game theorists would recognize as positive-sum games, where individual success contributed to community prosperity rather than creating zero-sum competition for limited resources. The trading expeditions that connected Viking communities to the broader medieval world operated on similar principles of mutual benefit and relationship building. Viking merchants weren't just buying and selling goods for immediate profit. They were building long-term relationships that could provide ongoing benefits for their home communities. Successful Viking traders understood that sustainable commercial relationships required delivering consistent value to their customers while building trust and reputation that would enable future transactions. They focused on developing expertise in specific products or markets that would make them valuable partners rather than just competing on price with other merchants. The trading relationships that Vikings developed often involved complex multi-year agreements that included credit arrangements, exclusive dealing provisions, and mutual support obligations that went far beyond simple commercial transactions. These relationships created what economists would recognize as relational contracts that were more flexible and durable than formal legal agreements. Viking merchants who had developed strong relationships with customers in distant markets could obtain favorable terms for their community's products while gaining early access to new goods and technologies that could benefit their home communities. They served as informal ambassadors who facilitated peaceful relationships and cultural exchange between different regions. The exploration and settlement activities that made Vikings famous throughout medieval Europe were natural extensions of these systematic approaches to relationship building and value creation. Viking exploration wasn't random adventure seeking. It was strategic expansion of their trading and social networks to create new opportunities for their communities. The settlement expeditions that established Viking communities in Iceland, Greenland, and North America were carefully planned investments that required enormous resources and coordination. These weren't desperate migrations by people fleeing problems at home. They were ambitious expansion projects by prosperous communities that had accumulated the surplus resources and expertise needed for such massive undertakings. The settlers who participated in these expeditions weren't just seeking new homes. They were establishing outposts that could provide their home communities with access to new resources, markets, and opportunities. The Icelandic settlements provided access to marine resources and strategic locations for Atlantic trading. The Greenland settlements provided access to Arctic products like walrus ivory and polar bear furs that commanded high prices in European markets. But establishing these settlements required more than just transportation and basic supplies. The settlers had to recreate all the sophisticated systems that supported Viking daily life in completely unfamiliar environments. They had to adapt their agricultural techniques to different soil and climate conditions. They had to modify their building methods to handle different materials and weather patterns. They had to establish new trading relationships with unfamiliar peoples and cultures. The success of these settlement projects demonstrates the remarkable adaptability and resilience of Viking cultural systems. The daily routines that had evolved in Scandinavian environments could be modified and adapted to function effectively in radically different circumstances while maintaining the essential characteristics that made them Viking communities. The cultural preservation mechanisms that enabled these distant settlements to maintain their Viking identity across multiple generations reveal sophisticated understanding of how cultural transmission works in distributed communities. Viking settlers didn't just try to replicate their homeland practices exactly. They preserved essential cultural elements while adapting surface characteristics to fit their new environments. The oral traditions that preserved Viking cultural knowledge were flexible enough to incorporate new experiences and local adaptations, while maintaining the core stories and values that defined Viking identity. The legal and social institutions that governed Viking communities could be adapted to handle new types of disputes and relationships, while preserving the fundamental principles that made them recognizably Viking. The religious and spiritual practices that provided meaning and motivation for Viking daily life could incorporate local elements and new experiences while maintaining the essential beliefs and values that connected Viking communities across vast distances. These adaptive cultural systems enabled Viking settlements to thrive independently while remaining part of the broader Viking cultural network. The military activities that supported Viking expansion and defense were integrated into these same systems of relationship building and value creation. Viking military expeditions weren't separate from their commercial and settlement activities. They were complementary strategies that used different methods to achieve similar goals of expanding opportunities and resources for Viking communities. The warrior culture that characterized Viking military activities was based on the same principles of individual excellence and community cooperation that governed other aspects of their daily life. Viking warriors weren't just individually skilled fighters. They were members of coordinated military systems that could execute complex tactical maneuvers while adapting quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The training systems that prepared Vikings for military service were integrated into their regular daily routines rather than being separate specialized activities. Young Viking men learned weapons skills alongside their agricultural and craft training. They developed the physical fitness and mental toughness needed for combat through the demanding work that characterized Viking daily life. But Viking military culture wasn't just about fighting skills. It was about creating coordinated organizations that could function effectively under extreme stress while maintaining the loyalty and cooperation that were essential for success. Viking military leaders understood that sustainable military effectiveness required more than just superior weapons and tactics. The wealth distribution systems that governed Viking military expeditions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how to maintain group cohesion and motivation during dangerous and demanding activities. Viking military leaders couldn't simply command obedience through fear or formal authority. They had to maintain the voluntary cooperation of their followers through fair treatment and shared benefits. The raiding activities that made Vikings infamous throughout medieval Europe were actually relatively small parts of their overall military activities. Most Viking military expeditions were defensive operations designed to protect their communities and trading relationships from hostile neighbors. Many others were essentially armed trading expeditions that used the threat of military force to ensure fair treatment in commercial negotiations. The reputation for military effectiveness that Vikings developed served important functions in their trading and diplomatic relationships. Communities that were known to be capable of defending themselves could negotiate from positions of strength and were less likely to be victimized by predatory neighbors. This reputation created what strategists would recognize as deterrent effects that prevented conflicts and enabled peaceful cooperation. The technological innovations that supported Viking military effectiveness emerged from the same systematic approaches to problem-solving and continuous improvement that characterized other aspects of their culture. Viking weapons and military equipment weren't just copied from existing designs. They were continuously refined and improved through systematic experimentation and testing. The metallurgy techniques that made Viking swords and axes superior to other medieval weapons resulted from generations of smiths who systematically tested new materials and methods while sharing their discoveries with other craftsmen. The shipbuilding innovations that made Viking vessels faster and more seaworthy emerged from similar processes of distributed experimentation and knowledge sharing. The tactical innovations that made Viking military forces effective weren't just individual insights by brilliant commanders. They were systematic developments that emerged from careful analysis of battlefield experiences and continuous refinement of training and organizational methods. But perhaps the most important military innovation that Vikings developed was their understanding of how to integrate military activities with their broader cultural and economic systems. Viking military capabilities weren't separate from their daily life activities. They were natural extensions of the same systematic approaches to organization and cooperation that governed all aspects of their society. The logistical systems that supported Viking military expeditions were based on the same resource management and planning techniques that governed their agricultural and trading activities. The leadership development that prepared Viking military commanders utilized the same educational and mentoring approaches that prepared craftsmen and merchants for their responsibilities. The intelligence gathering that informed Viking military strategies relied on the same information networks that supported their trading and diplomatic activities. Viking merchants, settlers, and travelers served as intelligence sources who provided military leaders with detailed information about potential threats and opportunities. The alliance systems that coordinated Viking military activities with friendly communities were extensions of the same relationship building and mutual obligation systems that governed their commercial and social interactions. Viking military alliances weren't just temporary conveniences for specific campaigns. They were long-term partnerships that created ongoing benefits for all participants. The conflict resolution mechanisms that terminated Viking military activities and restored peaceful relationships were based on the same negotiation and compensation principles that governed their legal and commercial disputes. Vikings understood that sustainable military success required more than just winning battles. It required creating stable relationships that could prevent future conflicts. The integration of all these military activities into Viking daily life created what military historians would recognize as total defense systems, where entire communities were organized to support military effectiveness while maintaining their civilian prosperity and cultural values. Viking communities didn't have to choose between military security and economic development. Their daily routines created both simultaneously. The artistic and cultural achievements that characterized Viking civilization were natural products of the same systematic approaches to excellence and innovation that governed their practical activities. Viking art, literature, and music weren't separate from their daily work. They were expressions of the same cultural values and aesthetic sensibilities that informed all aspects of their lives. The decorative arts that adorned Viking weapons, tools, and household items weren't just ornamental additions to functional objects. They were integral elements that expressed the cultural identity and social status of their owners, while demonstrating the artistic skills that were valued throughout Viking society. The complex, interlaced patterns that characterized Viking decorative arts required years of training and practice to master. These weren't simple designs that could be copied by anyone. They were sophisticated artistic traditions that preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge while providing opportunities for individual expression and innovation. The literary traditions that preserved Viking stories and cultural values were created and maintained through the same oral transmission systems that governed other aspects of their cultural preservation. The complex sagas that chronicled Viking history and mythology weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated educational tools that taught essential cultural knowledge while inspiring continued excellence and achievement. The poetic traditions that celebrated Viking achievements and values required mastery of complex linguistic and artistic techniques that were integrated into the general education that all Viking children received. These weren't specialized skills that only a few people possessed. They were cultural capabilities that were widely distributed throughout Viking society. The musical traditions that accompanied Viking social and religious activities served multiple functions that went beyond simple entertainment or aesthetic expression. Viking songs and musical performances were mnemonic devices that aided in memorizing important cultural information. They were social bonding activities that strengthened community relationships. They were spiritual practices that connected communities with their religious and cultural traditions. The architectural achievements that characterized Viking settlements were expressions of the same engineering knowledge and aesthetic sensibilities that informed their shipbuilding and craft production. Viking buildings weren't just functional structures designed to provide shelter. They were cultural statements that expressed the wealth, status, and values of their occupants while demonstrating the construction skills that were essential to community development. The great halls that served as centers of Viking social and political life were sophisticated architectural achievements that required advanced engineering knowledge and coordinated construction efforts. These buildings had to accommodate large gatherings while providing proper acoustics for speeches and performances. They had to demonstrate wealth and status while remaining practical and efficient. The religious architecture that characterized Viking spiritual life reflected the same integration of practical functionality with symbolic meaning that governed other aspects of their culture. Viking temples and sacred sites weren't just places for religious ceremonies. They were community centers that served multiple social and cultural functions, while expressing the spiritual beliefs that provided meaning and motivation for Viking daily life. The urban planning that characterized larger Viking settlements demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how physical environments affect social interactions and economic activities. Viking towns weren't just random collections of buildings. They were carefully designed communities that facilitated trade, social interaction, and cultural activities while providing security and efficiency. The harbour and waterfront facilities that supported Viking maritime activities were engineering achievements that required detailed knowledge of hydrodynamics, material science, and construction techniques. These facilities had to accommodate vessels of different sizes while providing efficient loading and unloading capabilities. They had to withstand harsh weather conditions while remaining functional and economical. The defensive fortifications that protected Viking communities were integrated into their urban planning in ways that provided security without disrupting normal daily activities. These weren't just military installations. They were community assets that served multiple functions while demonstrating the organizational capabilities that made Viking communities prosperous and influential. The road and transportation systems that connected Viking settlements were carefully planned infrastructure investments that facilitated trade, communication, and military mobility. These systems required significant resources and coordinated maintenance efforts, but they created economic benefits that far exceeded their costs by enabling more efficient movement of people and goods. The agricultural innovations that supported Viking communities were extensions of the same systematic approaches to problem solving and continuous improvement that characterized other aspects of their culture. Viking farming techniques weren't just traditional practices inherited from previous generations. They were continuously evolving systems that incorporated new knowledge and adapted to changing conditions. The crop selection and breeding programs that developed superior varieties of grains and vegetables required systematic observation and experimentation over multiple growing seasons. Viking farmers understood which characteristics were most important for their specific growing conditions and how to select and breed plants that would produce optimal results. The soil management techniques that maintained agricultural productivity over extended periods demonstrated sophisticated understanding of nutrient cycles and ecological relationships. Viking farmers knew how to rotate crops, manage organic matter, and control pests in ways that sustained productivity while improving soil quality over time. The livestock breeding programs that developed superior animals for different purposes required detailed knowledge of genetics and animal husbandry techniques. Viking farmers could produce animals that were optimized for specific purposes like milk production, meat quality, or draft work while maintaining overall herd health and productivity. The food preservation and processing techniques that enabled Vikings to store agricultural products for extended periods were sophisticated applications of chemistry and biology that required precise timing and careful attention to detail. These techniques enabled Viking communities to accumulate food surpluses that could support non-agricultural activities and provide security against crop failures. The integration of agricultural activities with other aspects of Viking daily life created what modern agriculturalists would recognize as sustainable farming systems that provided multiple benefits while maintaining long-term productivity. Viking farms weren't just food production facilities. They were integrated systems that produced raw materials for crafts, provided habitats for useful wildlife, and created pleasant living environments for farming families. But the most remarkable achievement of Viking agricultural systems was how they created the foundation for all the other activities that made Viking civilization possible. The agricultural surplus that Viking farmers produced through their systematic daily routines provided the resources that enabled Viking communities to support craftsmen, merchants, warriors, and explorers who created the achievements that made Vikings famous throughout the medieval world. The environmental management practices that enabled Vikings to thrive in challenging climates demonstrated sophisticated understanding of ecological systems and sustainable resource use. Vikings weren't just exploiting their natural environments for short-term gain. They were managing complex ecological relationships in ways that could maintain productivity and habitability over extended periods. The forestry practices that provided timber for construction and fuel for heating and metalworking were carefully managed to ensure sustainable harvests while maintaining forest health and productivity. Viking communities understood which trees to harvest, at what times, and how to manage forest regeneration to ensure continued availability of essential wood products. The fisheries management that provided essential protein and trade goods was based on detailed knowledge of fish life cycles and population dynamics. Viking communities developed fishing techniques and regulations that could harvest fish sustainably while maintaining healthy populations for future generations. The wildlife management that provided furs, ivory, and other valuable trade goods required sophisticated understanding of animal behavior and population ecology. Viking hunters and trappers knew how to harvest wildlife sustainably while maintaining the populations that were essential to their long-term prosperity. The water management systems that provided clean water for drinking, cooking, and craft production while managing waste disposal and flood control demonstrated advanced understanding of hydrology and public health. Viking communities developed water systems that could meet their needs while maintaining environmental quality and public health. The waste management practices that maintained sanitary conditions while recycling organic materials into useful products showed sophisticated understanding of material cycles and public health principles. Viking communities managed their waste streams in ways that prevented disease while recovering valuable materials for agricultural and craft production. The energy management systems that provided heating, lighting, and power for craft production were based on careful analysis of available resources and efficient utilization techniques. Viking communities developed energy systems that could meet their needs while conserving fuel resources and minimizing environmental impacts. The transportation systems that enabled Vikings to move people and goods efficiently across land and water were sophisticated applications of engineering knowledge and logistical planning. These systems enabled Viking communities to access distant resources and markets while maintaining the mobility that was essential to their cultural values and economic strategies. The communication systems that enabled Vikings to coordinate activities across vast distances were remarkable achievements in information management and social organization. These systems enabled Viking communities to maintain cultural coherence and economic cooperation while preserving the local autonomy that was essential to their adaptive capabilities. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Viking environmental management was how they created sustainable relationships with their natural environments that could support both immediate needs and long-term prosperity. Vikings understood that their survival and success depended on maintaining healthy ecosystems that could continue providing essential resources across multiple generations. The seasonal rhythms that governed Viking daily activities were carefully synchronized with natural cycles in ways that maximize productivity while minimizing environmental stress. Viking communities worked with natural patterns rather than against them, creating systems that were both efficient and sustainable. The resource allocation decisions that governed Viking economic activities were based on careful analysis of environmental carrying capacity and regeneration rates. Viking communities understood how much they could harvest from their environments without compromising future availability of essential resources. The settlement patterns that characterized Viking expansion were carefully planned to minimize environmental disruption while maximizing access to essential resources. Viking settlers chose locations that could support their communities while maintaining the ecological relationships that were essential to long-term sustainability. The technology choices that governed Viking craft production and construction activities were evaluated based on their environmental impacts as well as their immediate functionality. Vikings developed technologies that could meet their needs while remaining compatible with sustainable environmental management. The cultural values that guided Viking decision-making emphasized responsibility for future generations and respect for the natural world that provided the foundation for their prosperity. These values weren't just abstract ideals. They were practical guidelines that informed daily decisions about resource use and environmental management. The integration of environmental stewardship with economic development that characterized Viking civilization created what modern environmentalists would recognize as sustainable development that could support human prosperity while maintaining ecological health. Vikings demonstrated that it was possible to create prosperous communities that enhanced rather than degraded their natural environments. This environmental sustainability was essential to the long-term success of Viking civilization because their harsh climates and limited resources meant that environmental degradation could quickly lead to community collapse. Vikings had to develop sustainable practices because their survival depended on maintaining healthy ecosystems over extended periods. The remarkable story of Viking daily life reveals that their greatest achievements weren't just individual accomplishments by exceptional people. They were the products of sophisticated cultural systems that could support sustained excellence across multiple generations, while adapting to changing circumstances and new opportunities. The daily routines that governed Viking life weren't just efficient ways of accomplishing necessary tasks. They were systematic approaches to building adaptive capacity that enabled Viking communities to thrive under challenging conditions while pursuing ambitious goals that seemed impossible to their contemporaries. Every aspect of Viking daily life was designed to create value that extended beyond immediate needs to build capabilities that could support future achievements. Their morning routines weren't just about starting each day effectively. They were about maintaining the systems that enabled long-term prosperity and cultural continuity. Their work activities weren't just about producing goods and services for immediate consumption. They were about developing skills and relationships that could create new opportunities and overcome unexpected challenges. Their social activities weren't just about entertainment and relaxation. They were about building and maintaining the networks that enabled community cooperation and cultural preservation. Their seasonal festivals weren't just about celebrating achievements and marking important transitions. They were about renewing commitments and sharing knowledge that enabled continuous improvement and adaptation. Their religious observances weren't just about spiritual comfort and cultural identity. They were about maintaining the values and motivation that enabled sustained effort toward ambitious goals. The integration of all these activities into coherent daily routines that could support both individual flourishing and collective achievement represents one of history's most sophisticated examples of cultural engineering. Vikings created systems that were simultaneously stable and adaptive, traditional and innovative, local and global. Their success demonstrates that remarkable achievements are possible when people organize their daily activities around clear purposes while maintaining the flexibility needed to adapt to changing circumstances. The Vikings who performed these daily routines understood something profound about the relationship between individual excellence and collective prosperity. Their legacy extends far beyond their specific achievements in exploration, commerce, and military affairs. They demonstrated principles of organization and adaptation that remain relevant for anyone seeking to build sustainable success in an uncertain and rapidly changing world. The daily routines that enabled Vikings to reshape the medieval world offer timeless lessons about how to create systems that can support human potential while remaining capable of evolution and growth. Their story shows that sustainable prosperity requires more than just accumulating resources or achieving temporary advantages. True success comes from building adaptive capacity that can turn challenges into opportunities while preserving the values and relationships that make life meaningful. The Vikings who woke up before dawn to check their livestock were participating in cultural systems that created some of history's most remarkable achievements, while maintaining the human connections that gave those achievements lasting significance. Their daily routines weren't just about survival or even prosperity. They were about creating sustainable systems that could support human flourishing across multiple generations while adapting to whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. In understanding how Vikings structured their daily lives, we gain insights into fundamental principles of human organization that remain as relevant today as they were over 1,000 years ago. The remarkable integration of all these systems reveals something even more profound about Viking society that challenges everything we think we know about medieval life. Vikings didn't just create efficient daily routines or sophisticated organizational systems. They built something that modern complexity theorists would recognize as emergent intelligence, where the collective capabilities of their communities far exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. Think about this from the perspective of problem-solving capacity. When a Viking community faced an unprecedented challenge, like a complete crop failure or the arrival of hostile forces, they didn't depend on single leaders or predetermined solutions. Instead, they activated distributed intelligence networks that could rapidly process complex information, generate multiple options, and coordinate effective responses using the same collaborative systems that governed their daily routines. This emergent intelligence wasn't accidental or spontaneous. It was the deliberate result of daily practices that systematically developed both individual capabilities and collective coordination mechanisms. Every morning, when Vikings checked their livestock, they were practicing the observational and analytical skills that would prove essential during community crises. Every evening, when they shared stories and discussed daily events, They were strengthening the communication networks that enabled rapid information flow and collective decision-making. The apprenticeship systems that governed Viking skill development created what modern educators would recognize as peer learning networks, where knowledge was continuously refined and improved through collaborative practice. Master craftsmen didn't just teach established techniques to passive students. They created learning environments where apprentices could experiment, innovate, and contribute to collective knowledge while developing their individual expertise. These learning systems generated what innovation researchers call combinatorial creativity, where new solutions emerged from combining existing knowledge in novel ways. Viking innovations in shipbuilding, agriculture, and craftsmanship resulted from systematic processes that encouraged experimentation while preserving essential knowledge that had proven valuable over time. The seasonal work cycles that governed Viking daily activities created natural rhythms of focused execution and reflective analysis that enabled continuous learning and improvement. During intensive work periods, Vikings developed practical experience and identified problems that needed solutions. During quieter periods, they analyzed their experiences, shared insights with others, and developed innovations that could improve future performance. This cyclical approach to learning and development created what organizational psychologists would recognize as double-loop learning, where communities didn't just get better at executing existing practices, but continuously improved the practices themselves. Viking communities became progressively more capable over time because their daily routines included systematic mechanisms for identifying and implementing improvements. The resource-sharing systems that enabled Viking communities to support ambitious projects created what economists would call risk-pooling mechanisms that enabled individuals to pursue high-risk, high-reward strategies that would have been impossible without community support. When a young Viking wanted to join a trading expedition or establish a new settlement, the entire community could contribute resources and expertise that made success more likely. But these resource-sharing systems weren't just insurance mechanisms that protected against individual failures. They were investment systems that enabled communities to pursue collective strategies that created benefits for all participants. When Viking communities invested in shipbuilding projects or settlement expeditions, they weren't just supporting individual ambitions. They were creating capabilities and opportunities that would benefit future generations. The marriage and kinship networks that connected Viking families across vast distances created what social scientists would recognize as social capital that could be leveraged to create economic and political opportunities. These relationships weren't just personal connections. They were strategic assets that enabled access to resources, markets, and information that would otherwise be unavailable. Viking families understood that their prosperity depended not just on their individual capabilities, but on their position within broader social networks that could provide support during difficult periods and opportunities during favorable conditions. They invested significant time and resources in maintaining relationships that might not provide immediate benefits, but could prove essential for future success. The legal and political systems that governed Viking communities created what political scientists would call institutional capital that enabled stable cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution even when communities faced significant stress. These institutions weren't just rules and procedures. They were shared understandings about fairness, responsibility, and mutual obligation that enabled people to work together effectively despite having different interests and priorities. Viking legal traditions emphasized restoration and prevention rather than punishment, which helped preserve the social relationships that were essential for community prosperity. When conflicts arose, the goal wasn't to determine winners and losers, but to find solutions that could restore community harmony while preventing similar problems in the future. These conflict resolution mechanisms created what game theorists would recognize as positive sum outcomes, where all parties could benefit from peaceful solutions rather than destructive competition. Viking communities that developed effective conflict resolution capabilities became more attractive to potential members and trading partners, which created additional opportunities for growth and prosperity. The religious and spiritual systems that provided meaning and motivation for Viking daily activities created what psychologists would call intrinsic motivation, that enabled sustained effort toward challenging goals without external rewards or compulsion. Vikings weren't just working to avoid punishment or gain material benefits. They were participating in meaningful activities that connected them to larger purposes and enduring values. The seasonal festivals and religious observances that marked important points in the Viking calendar weren't just ceremonial activities. They were systematic renewal processes that reinforced motivation and commitment while celebrating achievements and acknowledging challenges. These events provided opportunities for communities to reconnect with their core values and recommit to their collective goals. The storytelling traditions that preserved Viking cultural knowledge weren't just entertainment or education. They were inspiration systems that provided examples of excellence and achievement that motivated continued effort and innovation. Young Vikings learned not just what their ancestors had accomplished, but how they had overcome obstacles and adapted to changing circumstances. These motivational systems created what positive psychologists would call eudaimonic well-being, where people experience satisfaction and fulfillment from pursuing meaningful goals and contributing to something larger than themselves. Vikings weren't just surviving or even prospering in material terms. They were living purposeful lives that created lasting value for their communities and future generations. The craft specialization systems that developed advanced skills and capabilities created what economists would recognize as human capital that could generate sustainable competitive advantages over time. Viking communities that invested in developing superior craftsmanship could command higher prices for their products while creating employment and prosperity for their members. But Viking craft development wasn't just about economic benefits. It was about cultural expression and artistic achievement that enriched community life and created objects of lasting beauty and significance. Viking craftsmen weren't just producing functional items. They were creating works of art that express cultural values while demonstrating technical excellence. The trading networks that connected Viking communities to distant markets created what network theorists would call small world effects, where information and resources could flow rapidly across vast distances through relatively short chains of personal relationships. These networks enabled Viking communities to access opportunities and resources that would otherwise be unavailable, while sharing risks and benefits across multiple participants. Viking merchants weren't just buying and selling goods for immediate profit. They were building relationships and gathering information that could benefit their entire communities over extended periods. They served as informal ambassadors who facilitated peaceful cooperation and cultural exchange, while identifying new opportunities for trade and settlement. The exploration and settlement activities that expanded Viking presence across the medieval world created what geographers would call spatial capital that provided strategic advantages and new opportunities for future generations. Viking settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and North America weren't just new homes for individual families. They were outposts that expanded the resource base and strategic options available to the entire Viking cultural network. These settlement projects required enormous investments of time, resources, and human effort that wouldn't provide immediate returns for the communities that supported them. But they created long-term strategic advantages that benefited Viking civilization for centuries by providing access to new resources, markets, and opportunities that wouldn't have been available otherwise. The military capabilities that protected Viking communities and supported their expansion created what strategists would call deterrent effects that prevented conflicts and enabled peaceful cooperation with neighboring peoples. Viking military reputation wasn't just about winning battles. It was about creating conditions that made peaceful solutions more attractive than violent alternatives. Viking communities that developed effective military capabilities could negotiate from positions of strength and were less likely to be victimized by predatory neighbors. This security enabled them to invest in long-term development projects and peaceful activities that created prosperity and cultural achievement. The technological innovations that supported Viking achievements in multiple fields created what historians would call technological systems that provided synergistic advantages across different activities. Viking innovations in metallurgy supported both weapons production and agricultural tools. Shipbuilding innovations enabled both trading expeditions and military campaigns. Agricultural innovations supported both population growth and resource accumulation for other activities. These technological systems weren't just collections of individual innovations, they were integrated capabilities that created competitive advantages across multiple domains, while enabling new possibilities that wouldn't have been available with any single technology alone. The cultural preservation mechanisms that maintained Viking identity across multiple generations and diverse environments created what anthropologists would call adaptive culture that could evolve and change while preserving essential characteristics. Viking communities could adapt to new environments and incorporate beneficial practices from other cultures while maintaining the core values and relationships that defined their identity. This cultural adaptability enabled Viking civilization to survive and thrive despite facing dramatic environmental changes, political upheavals, and cultural encounters that destroyed many other medieval societies. Vikings could maintain their essential characteristics while adapting to new circumstances because their cultural systems were designed for flexibility and resilience. The educational systems that prepared young Vikings for adult responsibilities created what developmental psychologists would call competence motivation that enabled lifelong learning and continuous improvement. Viking children didn't just learn specific skills and information. They developed learning capabilities and problem-solving approaches that would serve them throughout their lives. Viking educational practices emphasized understanding principles and developing judgment rather than just memorizing facts and procedures. This approach created adults who could adapt to new situations and continue learning throughout their lives, rather than being limited by their initial education. The environmental management practices that enabled Vikings to thrive in challenging climates created what ecologists would call sustainable relationships between human communities and natural ecosystems. Vikings understood that their long-term prosperity depended on maintaining healthy environments that could continue providing essential resources across multiple generations. Viking resource management wasn't just about immediate extraction and consumption. It was about maintaining productive capacity and ecological health that could support both current needs and future opportunities. This long-term perspective enabled Viking communities to avoid the environmental degradation that destroyed many other medieval civilizations. The integration of all these systems into coherent daily routines that could support both individual flourishing and collective achievement represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of social organization in medieval history. Vikings created cultural systems that were simultaneously stable and adaptive, efficient and flexible, local and global. Their success demonstrates that remarkable achievements are possible when people organize their daily activities around clear purposes, while maintaining the adaptability needed to pursue those purposes effectively under changing conditions. The Vikings who woke up before dawn to begin their daily routines were participating in cultural systems that would create some of history's most extraordinary achievements while preserving the human values that made those achievements meaningful. But the most profound lesson from Viking daily life isn't about their specific techniques or practices. It's about their understanding of how to create sustainable systems that could support human potential while remaining capable of growth and evolution. They understood that true prosperity required building adaptive capacity that could turn challenges into opportunities while maintaining the relationships and values that give life purpose and meaning. The daily routines that governed Viking life weren't just efficient ways of accomplishing necessary tasks. They were systematic approaches to building the capabilities, relationships, and cultural capital that enabled extraordinary achievements while creating sustainable foundations for future generations. Every aspect of their daily activities was designed to create value that extended far beyond immediate needs to build something larger and more enduring. When we examine Viking daily life through this comprehensive lens, we begin to understand why these remarkable people were able to achieve things that seemed impossible to their contemporaries while living in some of the world's most challenging environments. Their daily routines weren't just about getting through each day successfully. They were about participating in cultural systems that could support human flourishing across multiple generations while adapting to whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. The Vikings who performed these daily routines understood something profound about the relationship between individual excellence and collective prosperity, between tradition and innovation, between stability and change. Their legacy isn't just their specific achievements in exploration, commerce, and military affairs. It's their demonstration that human communities can create systems that enable both individual fulfillment and collective achievement, while remaining capable of continuous adaptation and improvement. Their story offers timeless insights into fundamental principles of human organization that remain as relevant today as they were over 1,000 years ago. In understanding what Vikings did all day, we gain more than historical knowledge. We discover principles for creating sustainable success that can support human potential while preserving the values and relationships that make that success meaningful and enduring. The remarkable daily life of Vikings reveals that their greatest achievement wasn't any single expedition or conquest. It was the creation of cultural systems that could support human flourishing while remaining capable of evolution and growth. Their daily routines provide templates for building sustainable prosperity that doesn't depend on static advantages or rigid structures, but on adaptive capacity that can turn any challenge into an opportunity for continued development and achievement.